Today we're going to enter right into the third chapter of Ruth, which continues the story of redemption and wedded love between Boaz and Ruth. In order to properly understand what this third chapter will relay, it needs to be compared with what was already seen in chapter 2. At that time, the two women, Naomi and Ruth, had just returned from Moab, and they were in a state of distress. It was Ruth who stepped forward to accomplish the work necessary to sustain the life of the two of these women. She offered to go and glean in the fields of Bethlehem, and Naomi consented, submitting to the will of Ruth. Ruth was not sent into the fields. She volunteered to go into them. Now in chapter 3, when the time of hardships have lessened because of Ruth's efforts, Naomi now takes the lead by initiating the action to be taken. And it is an action directed towards securing a place of rest for Ruth in the house of her own husband. And so there's a contrast which is evident here. The idea of working in order to help Naomi originates with Ruth, but the thought of happiness and contentment for Ruth and the carrying on of the family name originates with Naomi. Despite the originator of each, though, it is Ruth in whom the mission is accomplished. When she went to glean, it was as a foreigner and a widow. And she went there to exercise her rights in that status to work in the fields of Israel. 4 times in chapter 2, her Moabite origin was noted. She went with no particular place to glean, but merely where happenstance brought her. And she had no set plan. Whatever happened would be at the providence of the Lord. On the other hand, she's now going to be given definite instructions to go to a specific place with a set plan. Instead of uncertainty in what she would do, she's going to have a set purpose, and she's going to be determined in her mission. Instead of widow's garments, she's going to be wearing her finest apparel. And yet, she will be going with the redemption rights of a widow under the law of Israel. Never in this chapter will her country of origin be mentioned. The last chapter showed her rights to glean in order for her and her mother to physically live. This chapter will show her rights to be redeemed so that the family name will continue to live. In both chapters, though, there's a difficult task to undertake, and in some ways the second is actually more difficult than the first. As a gleaner, she could have been physically abused or humiliated, and yet she found grace. In this chapter, though, it's unlikely that she would be physically abused, but she still could be humiliated, or she could cause another person to be humiliated. In the previous chapter, she acted openly, and yet with a state of humility in her mind. She was faithfully working to feed herself and her mother-in-law. In this chapter, she will act secretly and with even greater humility to carry on the name of the family. In the previous chapter, she acted to overcome hunger and physical needs. In this chapter, she will act to overcome love and to fulfill her emotional needs. In the previous chapter, she demonstrated her promised faithfulness to Naomi. In this chapter, she will demonstrate obedience to Naomi. In both chapters, what is often mistaken as wrongdoing in Naomi for allowing Ruth to venture out is actually a credit to her. The faithfulness of Ruth shows that Naomi had truly won her love and that Ruth felt indebted to her for that affection. And in both chapters, we cannot assign our modern code of ethics or law upon the actions of either of these women. In both the gleaning and in the attempt to secure a kinsman redeemer, they're conducting themselves under the provisions of the law. Okay? This is the law of Israel, and it is within the accepted customs which are derived from that law. Ruth had the right to glean, and the additional blessings which were heaped upon her were by the grace of the one who granted them. But in granting them, it naturally led to the hope of fulfilling the second right. If Boaz had been harsh to her, then Naomi and Ruth would never have entered into exercising the second right, the right of redemption.